Sarah Bennett pulled into the parking lot of the Jefferson County Courthouse at precisely 9:15 a.m. on a bright Tuesday morning. She was not dressed like someone who owned half the commercial properties in downtown Jefferson, just simple blue jeans, a plain white shirt, and comfortable walking shoes, her usual outfit for property inspections. The morning had begun like any other. Sarah woke up at 5 a.m. in her modest 3-bedroom house on the outskirts of town, despite being worth millions. She loved to live modestly because her mother had always taught her that true wealth was not in conspicuous display, but in contributing to community development. As she went up the steps towards the courthouse, Sarah couldn't help but smirk as all this was falling in place. Just last week, her company had bought this very building in a private holding corporation. It was the latest purchase in a plan to upgrade the city's infrastructure while keeping rent for government agencies reasonable. Offices. The parking ticket in her hand was for a mere $50, which she received 2 weeks ago when one of the downtown meters had malfunctioned. Sarah tried calling the clerk's office to explain, but they insisted she appear in court. She had photos of the broken meter on her phone and all of the documentation. It should be a simple matter to resolve. Several people brushed past her down the courthouse steps, most of them in suits with a briefcase. A few nodded politely, not recognizing her as the owner of several buildings they worked in. Sarah liked it that way. At 35, she had constructed her empire of real estate quietly, her work talking for her instead of bragging about her success. Inside the courthouse, the air conditioning concealed her face with a shot of cold air. The marble floors glittered in the fluorescent lights, and the echo of footsteps reverberated off the high ceilings. Sarah checked the notice again. Courtroom 3B. Judge William Harrison presiding. The people around her were all Sarah could see while she waited on the wooden bench outside the courtroom. A young mother tried to quiet a crying baby, an older gentleman fidgeted through papers, and 2 teenagers in the corner spoke softly to one another. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone to go over the photos of the broken meter one more time. Right at 10 a.m., the BFF opened the courtroom doors. "All rise for the Honorable Judge William Harrison." His voice boomed through the room. Sarah stood with everyone else as a tall gray-haired man in black robes strode to the bench. Judge Harrison's reputation prized him, known for being strict traditional, and as some whispered, not completely neutral when it came to certain defendants. Sarah sat silent through several cases before her own. She watched how Judge Harrison treated each with varied degrees of patience. He was extremely nice to a young white college student who had been pulled over for speeding, but showed noticeable irritation with a Hispanic gentleman whose English was poor, as he attempted to explain his case involving a traffic violation. Case number 247, Sarah Bennett parking 6 violation. The clerk finally called out. Sarah strode with confidence to the podium, clutching. She had hardly started her documentation when the expression on Judge Harrison's face subtly changed. He looked up from his papers and caught her. His eyes narrowed and his mouth turned into a thin line. "Miss Bennett," he said, drawing out her name with an edge of condescension. "You're here for a parking violation on Oak Street, dated October 15th. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah said politely. "I have in my possession proof that the meter was on the fritz that day." "Several other people received the same, Miss Bennett," interrupted Judge Harrison. "The citation clearly states your meter expired at 2:15 p.m. Are you suggesting our city's equipment is faulty?" Sarah tried again. "Your Honor, if you'll just look at these photos, I have heard enough excuses today." Judge Harrison cut her off again. His voice carried a tone that many in the courtroom recognized. He had already made up his mind. What Judge Harrison didn't know, as he sat high on his bench looking down at Sarah Bennett in her simple clothes, was that this particular case would soon become the talk of Jefferson County. He had no idea that the quiet woman standing before him owned not only this building, but the ground it sat on, along with hundreds of others in this city. Sarah stood calmly, waiting to see what would transpire next. Years of negotiations in business had taught her patience. Sometimes, she knew, you had to let things play out to create real change. The following minutes would trigger activities that would alter not only the career of Judge Harrison, but that of the whole Jefferson County justice system. Judge Harrison bent forward in his chair, his cold eyes looking down to Sarah. The courtroom was silent except for the hum of air conditioning, the soft rustling of papers. The tension was palpable in the air. "Mississippi Bennett," Judge Harrison said, voice oozing sarcasm. "Maybe you don't know how things go down in my courtroom. We all waste our precious time with excuses about broken meters." He picked up her file and flipped through it with showy slowness. Still composed, Sarah's heart beat faster. She had dealt with people like Judge Harrison before, people who saw what they wanted to see and made passing judgment by appearances. She tried once more to explain, "Your Honor, I have photos that clearly show." Silence. Judge Harrison's voice thundered across the courtroom. A number of the audience members literally jumped out of their seats. "I will not have interruptions in my courtroom." Sarah wasn't the only one who noted how very different that tone was from the one had adopted just 15 minutes earlier, when he let a young white male run on for almost 10 minutes making his case. Stark contrast, and she was not alone in noticing. The court reporter had stopped typing and was watching the scene with concerned eyes now. Then Judge Harrison continued, "This is your third parking violation this year." He looked at her with disapproval, not knowing that the other tickets had already been dismissed when Sarah proved the same meter was broken. "Actually, Your Honor," Sarah spoke carefully, "those previous citations were dismissed because did I give you permission to speak?" Judge Harrison's face was turning slightly red. He turned to his clerk. "Show me M. Bennett's record." The young clerk Amy hesitated for a moment. She had seen the dismissal records, but seemed even more terrified to disagree with the judge. "Sir, previous citations were not to be considered, it seemed." Judge Harrison dismissed the comment with a wave of his hand. "Miss Bennett, your repeated flouting of our city's parking regulations demonstrates a disregard for authority." Several around the courtroom stirred in their chairs. A few gave nervous glances across the room. Even the bailiff, who had worked alongside Judge Harrison for years, seemed uneasy on his feet. Sarah stood proud and tall. Business meetings were nothing new to her. People had always talked down to her ideas. Yet this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about anyone who had ever been at the raw end of a deal in this very courtroom. Besides, Judge Harrison continued shuffling papers on his desk. "Your casual attitude today shows a lack of respect for this court." He looked down disapprovingly at her jeans and comfortable work shirt, not knowing she had already inspected 3 building sites that Ming. The irony of those words wasn't lost on Sarah. She had signed the papers finalizing her purchase of the courthouse building just last week. The deed was probably still sitting on some desk in the county clerk's office. "Given your history and attitude," Judge Harrison declared, clearly reveling in his moment of authority, "I am going to impose a fine of $5,000. A collective gasp ran through the courtroom. Even the other court officials looked shocked. This clearly excessive, Your Honor, was the standard fine for parking violation, $50. Sarah began, voice steady, despite her growing anger. "I would like to appeal this decision." Judge Harrison smiled coldly. "You have that right, of course, but be aware that filing an appeal will add court costs to your fine. Now, do you have anything else to say before we conclude this matter?" Sarah looked around the courtroom. She saw the worried faces of other people waiting for their cases to be heard. She saw the court reporter, who had stopped typing and was staring at her computer screen in disbelief. She saw Amy, the clerk, biting her lip nervously. "No, Your Honor," Sarah replied quietly, "I believe everything that needs to be said will come out soon enough." Judge Harrison, he had missed the subtle meaning in her words, and was already reaching for his gavel to move on to the next case. "Very well. Pay the fine within 30 days, or face additional penalties." Next case. Sarah stood and turned to leave, as she met the gaze of Emmy, the clerk. The young woman mouthed, "I'm sorry," while Judge Harrison wasn't looking. Sarah gave her a small, knowing smile. As she walked out of the courtroom, Sarah pulled out her phone. She had a meeting with the county commissioner in exactly 1 hour, a meeting about renovation plans for this very courthouse. Sometimes it was a moot thought now. Justice works in strange ways, and the truth about the real ownership of the CORHOC was just about to get out. Judge Harrison's world was going to change forever. Sarah walked down the courthouse hallway, the unfair $5,000 fine notice clutched in her hand. She glanced at her watch, 11:30 a.m. And her meeting with County Commissioner James Thompson was at noon. A small smile played on her lips as she headed toward the courthouse cafeteria to grab a quick coffee. The cafeteria was busy with the usual mix of courthouse employees, lawyers, and visitors. Sarah stood in line overhearing snippets of conversation about what had just happened in courtroom 3B. Word was spreading fast about Judge Harrison's excessive fine. "Did you hear about that parking ticket case?" one young lawyer whispered to another. $5,000 for a parking violation? That's insane. Classic Harrison, his fellow judge replied, shaking his head. "He's been getting worse lately. Somebody needs to report him to the Judicial Review Board." Sarah paid for her coffee and found a quiet corner table. She pulled out her phone and called her assistant. "Michael, could you bring the courthouse renovation plans to my meeting with Commissioner Thompson?" And yes, everything is going exactly as we expected. Meanwhile, back in his chambers, Judge Harrison was feeling quite pleased with himself. He sat in his leather chair eating the sandwich his secretary had brought him for lunch. A knock on his door interrupted his meal. "Come in," he called out, mouthful of turkey sandwich. Emmy, the court clerk, entered nervously. "Judge Harrison, I think there's something you should know about the Bennett case from this morning." "What about it?" he asked, barely looking up from his desk. "Sir, I checked her rec more thoroughly. Those previous tickets were all dismissed with evidence. The meter on Oak Street has been malfunctioning for months. The city's maintenance records confirm it." Judge Harrison waved his hand dismissively. "It no longer matters. The fine has been determined. She will not disrespect my courtroom again." Amy was more hesitant this time. "There is something more, sir. I saw her name on some documents that came through the county clerk's office last week." But before she could conclude, Judge Harrison's phone rang. It was the county commissioner's office. He was to attend a meeting at 12:30 p.m., something about courthouse renovations. The secretary responded in the cafeteria. Sarah finished her coffee just as Michael arrived with a thick folder full of blueprints and documents. "Perfect timing," she said, standing up. "Let's head to the commissioner's office." Commissioner Thompson's office was located on the top floor of the courthouse, having great views across the city. When Sarah and Michael entered, Thompson greeted them warmly. "Miss Bennett, so glad you could make it. I've been eager to talk about how you intend to enhance the building." Motioned for them to take a seat in the plush chairs in front of his desk, Sarah unrolled the blueprints onto the commissioner's substantial desk. "As you can see, we're renovating, yet keeping the historic integrity of the building. The first phase involves renovating all the courtrooms to include improved acoustics and new technology." They were deep in discussion when there was another knock at the door. Judge Harrison entered, then stopped dead in his tracks as his eyes landed on Sarah sitting there. His face went white. "Ah, Judge Harrison," Commissioner Thompson chirped cheerfully. "Perfect timing. I wanted you to meet Ms. Bennett properly. She's the new owner of the courthouse building. She's planning some really great improvements to your courtroom." Judge Harrison stood frozen in the doorway. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Sarah turned to face him, professional and composed. "Judge Harrison and I have already met," she said coolly. "In fact, he just fined me $5,000 for a parking violation at a meter that maintenance records show has been broken for months." Commissioner Thompson's eyebrows rose. $5,000 for a parking ticket? Yes, Sarah continued, her voice steady. "It was quite an interesting experience seeing how justice is administered in the courthouse. I now own the color." Drained from Judge Harrison's face as the reality of the situation sunk in. The woman he had treated so dismissively less than 2 hours ago wasn't just any citizen, she was his new landlord. I believe, Sarah added, turning back to the blueprints, that courtroom 3B will be the first to receive renovations. We'll need temporarily relocate those proceedings during construction. Of course, Judge Harrison remained standing in the doorway, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The day that started off so routine had now just taken a completely unexpected turn, and he had a feeling this was only the beginning of his problems. The news spread like wildfire through the Jefferson County Courthouse. By 2 p.m., every person from the janitors all the way up to the senior judges knew what had occurred in Commissioner Thompson's office. It was one of those stories that grew with every telling. It was about how Judge Harrison had unfairly fined the very woman who owned the building they all were working in. Judge Harrison sat in his chambers. His hand shook slightly as he poured his third cup of coffee. The morning's events replayed over and over again in his mind. He had been so quick to judge Sarah Bennett, so sure of his authority, and now it was all falling apart. There was a knock at the door. He jumped. It was Chief Judge Martinez, his supervisor. "Bill, we need to talk." Chief Judge Martinez said, closing the door behind him. His face was serious. "I've received 3 calls in the last hour about what happened this morning. The local news is asking for comments." Judge Harrison slumped in his chair. "I didn't know who she was," he said weakly. "That's exactly the problem," Martinez replied sharply. "You shouldn't treat anyone that way regardless of who they are. $5,000 for a parking ticket. What were you thinking?" Meanwhile, Sarah sat in her downtown office reviewing emails were arriving. Local civil rights groups did wish to meet with her. Others said that they too had been treated in this manner within Judge Harrison's courtroom and wished to share their experiences with her. Her assistant, Michael, knocked and then entered carrying a stack of papers. "Miss Bennett, the courthouse maintenance records you requested are here. They're the reports showing that the meter on Oak Street has been called in as broken a total of 8 times over the past 3 months. Sarah nodded, looking through the documents. "And the video footage, right here," Michael said, placing a USB stick on her desk. "The cameras around the courtroom caught everything in there." The court reporter also emailed over the official transcript. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, Amy, the clerk, was busy pulling files from Judge Harrison's previous cases. She had been keeping notes for months, fearing the pattern she saw in his rulings. Now finally, someone might actually listen. Judge Harrison's secretary knocked on his door once more. "Sir, there is a reporter from the Jefferson Daily News on line 1. They're running a story about this." "Tell them no comment," he barked, immediately feeling sorry because he knew it was the wrong tone. He was beginning to realize just how often he spoke to people like that. Back at 3:30 p.m., Sarah had another meeting, this time with her attorneys. They sat in her conference room, going over the morning's events. The fine was clearly excessive, her lead attorney said, but more importantly, "We found a pattern of similar behavior in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The data represents significant discrepancies in the way he sentences different defendants based on their race and physical appearance." Sarah gazed out her office window at the building housing the courthouse across the street. "This has nothing to do with revenge," she reflected. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." In the meantime, Judge Harrison received a different visitor, his old friend, fellow Judge Robert Chin. "Bill," Judge Chin said, taking his seat heavily, "I've been your friend 20 years. I have got to tell you something. What transpired today, that is not an isolated incident. We have all seen how you treat certain defendants differently." Judge Harrison started protesting, but Judge Chin helped hold up his hand. "Listen to me. This is your wake-up call. You can either learn from it, or it can be the end of your career." Late afternoon, Sarah received a call from Commissioner Thompson. "Miss Bennett, the Judicial Review Board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They're requesting your presence." "It'll be there," Sarah replied. "And, Commissioner, please make sure Judge Harrison knows that my plans for renovating his courtroom haven't changed. Sometimes, the best way to fix a broken system is from within." As the sun had set over Jefferson County, Sarah was sitting in her office deep in thought over the events of the day, while Judge Harrison sat in his. For Sarah, it was just another step in her quiet mission to better her community. For Judge Harrison, it marked the beginning of a painful but much-needed lesson concerning justice, prejudice, and the consequences of judging a book by its cover. The real changes were only just beginning, and tomorrow would bring even more surprises for everyone concerned. The next morning, the Jefferson County Judicial Review Board convened, and their 7 members and all sat around the huge oak table, at the head of which sat Chairman David Roberts. The room, on the top floor of the courthouse, was tight with an air of waiting for Sarah Bennett at exactly 9:00 a.m. feeling. This time, without any thought that her position of authority was merely symbolic, Sarah walked in smartly attired in a navy blue suit. Her lawyer, Jennifer Martinez, was large and biger, carrying a thick, full folder of documents. "Thank you for coming, Miss Bennett," Chairman Roberts said, gesturing to an empty chair. "We have called this emergency meeting to address yesterday's incident and some broader concerns that have come to light." Just then Amy, the court clerk, entered with a cart full of files. "These are all the cases from Judge Harrison's courtroom over the past year," she explained, her voice shaking slightly. "I've been keeping track of the patterns." The board members looked at the mountain of files with concern. SS lawyer stood up and began distributing reports she had prepared. "What you're receiving," Jennifer explained, "is a statistical analysis of Judge Harrison's rulings over the past 12 months. The data shows clear patterns of bias in his sentencing." Chairman Roberts put on his reading glasses and studied the first page. His frown deepened. "According to these numbers, Judge Harrison gives fines averaging 200% higher to minorities compared to white defendants for the same violations." Down in his chambers, Judge Harrison sat alone, waiting. He hadn't slept that well, having spent most of the night thinking about his actions. His phone rang non-stop from the reporter calls, each of which he avoided. Sarah's voice was calm as she addressed the board. "Yesterday's incident about my parking ticket is not just about me. It's about each and every one of those who ever stepped into that courtroom and were dealt unfairly with." The board members listened as Sarah played the security footage from the previous day. They watched Judge Harrison's dismissive, interruptive behavior, and his way of sentencing an unfair, excessive fine. Then they watched footage from other cases showing how differently he treated the defendants. "This is disturbing," said board member Janet Chun, shaking her head. "What's even more disturbing is that it was allowed to continue for such a long period." Emmy spoke again. "We did. Most of us were too afraid to say anything. Judge Harrison is very powerful here." The meeting had reached its midway when Commissioner Thompson arrived with more evidence. "We've obtained the maintenance records for that parking meter," he said. "It was reported broken many times." Judge Harrison had this information, but he didn't act on it. Sarah stood up and went to the window. She looked down at the city below. "I am not here to demand Judge Harrison's removal," she said, surprising everyone. "I'm here to propose a solution." She turned back to face the board. "As the owner of this building, I have plans for renovations. But maybe we need to renovate more than just the physical structure. Maybe we need to change how justice is administered here." The board members exchanged glances. Chairman Roberts leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Bennett?" "A complete overhaul of the system," Sarah replied. "Mandatory bias training for all court officials, regular review of sentencing patterns, and a new community oversight committee. I'm willing to fund these programs myself." The room fell silent for a moment, each person weighing her words. Finally, board member Michael Wong spoke up. "We should also review all of Judge Harrison's recent cases." Some people may be entitled to refunds or appeals. Sarah nodded and said, "I'd like to be a part of that process." News undulated through the courthouse on what was taking place as the meeting continued. Workers huddled in small groups talking about how things might change. A few were nervous, but many felt hopeful that by noon the board had reached several decisions. Judge Harrison would be temporarily suspended pending a full investigation. All his recent cases would be reviewed, and most importantly, Sarah's proposed reforms would go into place. As Sarah exited the meeting, she walked past Judge Harrison's empty courtroom. Through its window, his vacant judge's chair was starkly visible. Sometimes she thought the biggest changes begin with the smallest incidences, such as a simple parking ticket. The real work in Jefferson County was just beginning. Courthouse House would never be the same again. Judge William Harrison sat alone in his home study, staring at the suspension letter from the Judicial Review Board. The headline of the morning newspaper stared at him from where it lay across his desk. Local judge under investigation. Years of bias rulings exposed. His phone had been ringing incessantly for the past 2 days, but he hadn't answered a single call. His wife, Linda, tapped lightly on the study door and then came in with his coffee. "Bill," she said softly, "you need to eat something. You've been sitting here since yesterday." He looked up at his wife of 30 years, seeing the concern in her eyes. "How did I not see it, Linda?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All these years, I thought I was being fair." Linda sat down across from him. "Remember what your father used to say about Judge Matthews back in the 60s, how he treated your Irish immigrant grandparents in his courtroom?" The memory hit Judge Harrison hard. His grandfather had lost his small business because of Judge Matthews' unfair ruling. He had promised himself he would never be that kind of judge. Yet here he was decades later, pulling the same on others. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Amy the clerk was working late, helping the review team go through Judge Harrison's old cases. Each file told a story of subliminal bias: higher fines for minorities, stricter sentences, less patience during hearings. "Check this out," Amy said to Jennifer Martinez, Sarah's lawyer. "A young black man got 6 months for the same offense that a white college student got community service for just last month." Sarah Bennett walked in, carrying takeout dinner. "For the team, how many cases have we reviewed so far?" "Over 200, Jennifer replied, rubbing her tired eyes. "The pattern is clear. In almost everyone back at his house." Judge Harrison finally decided to watch the security footage from his courtroom that the board had provided for 6 hours straight. He watched himself in case after case. He saw his expressions, heard his tone, noticed his different treatment of defendants based on their appearance and race. In one video, he watched himself interrupt a Hispanic mother trying to explain her situation, while in the following case, he listened to a white businessman for nearly 20 minutes. The contrast was painful to watch. Later that evening, Judge Harrison's daughter, Rachel, a law student, came to visit. She found him still in his study, surrounded by case files he had brought home. "Dad," she said, sitting next to him, "my professor used one of your cases as an example in class today, not in a good way." He looked at his daughter, seeing the disappointment in her eyes. "I bet you down, haven't I? You can still make it." "Okay," Rachel responded. "But first you really need to grasp where you went wrong." Sarah sat at her desk in her office, studying the recommended reforms to take place at the courthouse. Revisions had been made to the blueprints for structural changes that included a new community justice center, which would house regular training for judges regarding issues of bias and equal justice. Her phone beeped, indicating an incoming message. It was from Linda Harrison, the judge's wife. "Miss Bennett, my husband would like to see you, not to explain himself but to hear and learn. Would you be willing to give him that chance?" Sarah stared at the message for a long period of time. This wasn't about revenge or punishment. This was about creating real change. Sometimes, that means giving people the opportunity to learn from their mistakes. She typed in her response, Mañana morning, 9 a.m. I tell him, bring the copious notes he must have made in reviewing his cases that night. Both Sarah and Judge Harrison lay awake, each in their respective homes, thinking about the meeting ahead. It was for Sarah a step further toward her goal of improving the justice system, and for Judge Harrison, an opportunity to begin to make amends for years of unconscious bias. The next day would bring either real change or the final end of Judge Harrison's career. Everything depended on what he had learned from his time of reflection, and if he was really ready for a change. That the reforming of Jefferson County's justice system was about to take the next ph at exactly 9 a.m. Judge William Harrison was standing outside the Sarah Bennett office building, his hands shaking as he held a thick notebook full of his observations that he had made while reviewing his past cases. He hardly slept, writing down most of the night what instances of bias he had found in his rulings. The security guard at the front desk looked at him with recognition. "Miss Bennett is expecting you, Judge Harrison." 15th floor. It seemed to take forever, but finally, the elevator doors opened and Sarah's assistant, Michael, greeted him. "Please follow me, Judge Harrison. Miss Bennett will see you now." Sarah's office was simple in style, yet elegant. Large windows looked out over the courthouse, where the man standing before her had presided over thousands of cases for 20 years. She stood upon his entrance and motioned him toward a chair across from her desk. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison said, his voice more humble than it had ever been. "I know I don't deserve your time." Sarah regarded him closely, as the gone was the arrogant judge from a few days earlier. In his place sat a man who looked as if he hadn't slept in days, the weight of his realizations heavy upon his shoulders. "Judge Harrison," Sarah began, "I didn't come here to hear apologies. I want to hear what you've learned from reviewing your cases." He opened his notebook with shaking hands. "I thought I spent the last 3 days watching videos from my courtroom and reading through my old cases. The patterns are clear now. I was harder on minorities, quicker to interrupt them, less likely to believe their explanations." Sarah listened wordlessly as Judge Harrison ran through individual cases. He had listed names and dates and descriptions of how his bias had led him to decide against certain outcomes. "There was Maria Rodriguez," he said, his voice cracking. "She tries to explain that she's late because her child was in the hospital. I fined her $500 for contempt. The very next day, I uncritically accepted a similar excuse from a white defendant." Tears welled up in his eyes as he continued, "And James Washington, a young black man who got 6 months for a minor offense that I usually gave community service for. These are just 2 examples out of hundreds." Sarah took out her own folder. "We've been reviewing those cases too, Judge Harrison. What do you think should be done about them?" "They all deserve new hearings," he replied without hesitation, "and I've written personal letters to each person I treated unfairly, admitting my bias and apologizing. They're all in this folder." He placed another thick envelope on her desk. Sarah raised her eyebrows, genuinely surprised. She hadn't expected him to take such an initiative. "But that's not enough," Judge Harrison continued. "I want to do more. I've enrolled in bias training courses and am working with civil rights organizations to better understand the impact of systemic racism in our justice system." For the first time since the meeting began, Sarah smiled slightly. "That's a good start, Judge Harrison. But what about the future? What happens when you return to the bench?" Judge Harrison straightened in his chair. "If I'm allowed to return, I want to implement a system where all my rulings are reviewed monthly for bias. I want to work with community leaders to understand their perspectives." And he paused, taking a deep breath. "I want to mentor young judges to help them avoid making the same mistakes I did." Sarah got up and went to the window, looking out at the courthouse. "Judge Harrison, when I bought that building, I didn't just buy property. I bought an opportunity to make a change. Your situation has given us an opportunity to change the entire system." She turned around to face him. and willing to support your return to the bench. Under certain conditions, you will work with our new Community Oversight Committee. You will participate in regular bias training, and most importantly, you will help us implement these changes across the entire courthouse. Judge Harrison nodded eagerly. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Good. Sarah added, because this isn't just about you anymore. This is about building a justice system that serves everyone truly equally. As Judge Harrison was leaving the office of Sarah that morning, he had felt humbled yet hopeful because he was accorded a second chance. Not only did he have a chance to redeem his career, but he also was going to be part of changes that were badly needed within the system in which he had served so many years. It had started in Judge Harrison and was also underway in the Jefferson County justice system. 3 months had passed since that day when Sarah Bennett took the meeting with Judge Harrison. At this time, the Jefferson County Courthouse was not the same. Workers were busy reconstructing the building, but the most important changes were not in the walls. They had happened to the people. On this morning, in particular, Judge Harrison stood before a crowded courtroom. However, instead of sitting on the bench, he was standing in front of a group of judges, barristers, and court staff teaching on the subject of unconscious bias. Last year, I would have said I didn't hold any bias, he said to the riveted group. Let me show you precisely how bias can seep into our decisions without us even realizing it. Standing at the rear of the room, Sarah smiled wryly. The man speaking was so unlike the arrogant judge who had fined her 3 months earlier. His hair was grayer now, but his eyes wore wisdom that had not been there before. Emmy, court clerk, raised her hand. Judge Harrison, what's the biggest change you've noticed in yourself since the training began? Harrison smiled thoughtfully. I listened more. Really listened. Yesterday a young man came in for a traffic violation. In the past, I would have rushed through his explanation. Instead, I learned he was driving his sick mother to chemotherapy. That context mattered. Meanwhile, in another part of the courthouse, the new Community Oversight Committee was meeting. The committee created by Sarah included people from all parts of the community: teachers, social workers, ex-defendants, and civil rights activists. They are coming in gratifying numbers. Jennifer Martinez, attorney for Sarah, reported to the committee, in the last 3 months, we reviewed over 500 old cases. More than 200 people received refunds for excessive fines, and 50 cases have been reopened for new hearings. Back in the training session, Judge Harrison showed video clips from his old court sessions and compared them with recent ones. The difference was striking. Watch how I interrupted this woman 6 times in 2 minutes, he said, pointing to an old video. Now, watch a similar case from last week. Defendant speaks freely and justice is better served because of it. During the lunch break, Sarah met with Commissioner Thompson in the new courthouse cafe, another of her improvements to the building. The changes you and Judge Harrison have made are spreading, Thompson said, excitedly. 3 other courthouses in the state have inquired about instituting similar training programs. Sarah nodded, stirring her coffee. That's good news. But we're just getting started. Next week we're launching the Youth Justice Program. The Youth Justice Program was Sarah's latest initiative. It would bring high school students into the courthouse to learn about the legal system and participate in mock trials. Judge Harrison had volunteered to lead the program later that afternoon. A familiar face appeared in Judge Harrison's new courtroom: Maria Rodriguez, the woman he had unfairly fined months ago. This time, she was there to join. The Community Oversight Committee welcomed Mrs. Rodriguez, Harrison said warmly, stepping down from the bench to greet her. Your perspective will be invaluable to our committee. Maria looked surprised at his friendly manner. Gracias, Judge Harrison. My English is not perfect yet. Your English is good, he assured her, and we now have court translators available whenever needed. That's one of the many changes Ms. Bennett helped us implement. On her way out at the end of the day, Sarah walked through the courthouse observing all the changes that were made. The walls had fresh paint, but more importantly, The halls were filled with new faces from all parts of the community, even now welcome in their courthouse. She walked by Judge Harrison's courtroom one last time. He was still there thumbing through cases with a young law student intern. "Remember," she heard him say, "justice is not just a matter of the law but of the human being who is standing before you." Sarah smiled to herself. The parking ticket that had started all this was framed in her office now, a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments. As she left the building, she saw a new beginning was a group of community members entering into the evening's public forum. The courthouse had now ceased to be just a building where justice was served but had, in fact, turned into a center for community transformation. This story of the judge and the owner of the courthouse made it symbolic of change in Jefferson County and beyond, into courthouses within the state. Sometimes true justice starts with one person who's willing to learn from their mistakes and another person who is willing to give them that chance. It had been a year since the day Sarah Bennett walked into Judge Harrison's courtroom for a simple parking ticket. The anniversary of the Justice Reform Program in Jefferson County Courthouse was running its first anniversary, and the main hall was full of every kind of person. Sarah stood at the podium and looked into the crowd. In the front row sat Judge Harrison with his family alongside Maria Rodriguez, Emmy the clerk, and many others who had been part of this incredible journey a year ago. Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. "I walked into this courthouse as just another human being with a parking ticket. Today, we gather to celebrate something way larger than any one person or story." The walls of the courthouse told their own story. New signs in multiple languages welcomed visitors. Works from local artists adorned the halls in which scenes of justice and community were depicted. Every tom now had translation services and cultural sensitivity advisors. Judge Harrison stood up to speak next, who recently was appointed to take over judicial training. He looked different from a year ago, much more humble, more approachable, and definitely wiser. "Last year, I made a mistake that could have ended my career," he said honestly. "Instead, thanks to him, Bennett's vision, it became an opportunity to create real change. We've helped other people learn from my mistakes." The numbers spoke for themselves. On a large board where the year's achievements read, 1,000 cases reviewed and corrected, 300 judges and court staff trained in bias awareness, 50 community programs launched, 5 other courthouses adopting their reform model, 0 complaints of racial bias in the past 6 months. Maria Rodriguez stepped forward to tell her story. "A year ago, I was afraid to come to this courthouse," she said. Her English now much improved. "I help other people feel welcome here. This is what real justice looks like." Amy, who had been promoted to Chief Court Administrator, presented the next phase of their programs. "Starting next month, we're opening the Youth Justice Academy. High school students will learn about law and justice from Judge Harrison and other reform judges in the audience." Local news reporters took notes. The Jefferson County Courthouse had become a national model for justice reform. Visitors from other states regularly came to learn from their example. Sarah listened as Judge Harrison's daughter, Rachel, also a newly graduated LA lawyer, spoke about the legal clinic she was opening in the courthouse. It would offer free legal assistance to those who could not afford lawyers. "My father's experience taught our whole family about the importance of fair justice," Rachel said. "Now I want to help make sure everyone has access to it." Near the end of the ceremony, a surprise guest arrived, the mayor of Jefferson City. He carried an official proclamation declaring this day Justice Reform Day in the city. "What happened in this courthouse over the past year proves that even change is possible," the mayor said. "One parking ticket brought a complete reform to our system of justice." Judge Harrison approached to Sarah holding something in his hands. It was a framed copy of the original $5,000 fine he had given her. "I keep this in my chambers," he said softly. "It reminds me every day to look past my assumptions and to see the real person standing before me." Sarah smiled and pulled out her own copy of the same ticket, which she had framed in her office. "Sometimes, the best lessons come from unexpected places," she replied. Stories were shared throughout the celebration about ways in which the courthouse had affected the lives of its people. A young man spoke about getting a second chance through the new rehabilitation program. A grandmother spoke about how the new translation services had helped her family make their way through the courts. The day closed with a community dinner, and the people of all colors were sitting together in the courthouse plaza, sharing food and stories. Judge Harrison was sitting with Maria Rodriguez's family, learning Spanish from her children. Sarah watched it all from a quiet corner, a proud feeling welling up inside her about what they had pulled off. The parking ticket that started it all was now a faraway memory, but its ramifications would go on and on for generations to come. The Jefferson County Courthouse wasn't a building anymore. It was a beacon of how justice, truly blind to color and status, would change an entire community. As the sun set on this celebration, Sarah knew this was not the end of this story, but rather a new chapter in the ongoing struggle toward true justice for all.